Emulators are pretty great, aren't they? They're the sole reason retro gaming is as accessible as it is. I reckon most gamers are used to using console emulators, as that's the primary way publishers are redistributing their old games. It works. As long as the games play perfectly fine, then it'll be acceptable for most gamers. I understand that for most hardcore folks, these console emulator solutions don't really offer a whole lot in the way of options and features. For some, it's pretty bare bones and don't really offer much in terms of value outside of the game itself. I get it, but I do think emulated retro re-releases are still really important, not only for preservation, but also casual accessibility. Hate to say it, but it's still far easier recommending these re-releases to those simply wanting to play a game, opposed to installing PC emulators and engaging in
piracy! Access
With that said, it is certainly true that emulated efforts on PC are way ahead of the curve in regards to features, enhancements, and options. So for those who'd like to dip their toes in the realm of PC emulation, there is a lot to try and experiment with. I remember when I started messing with unofficial emulation, it all started when I hacked my Wii, since I got tired of not so much waiting for games to come to Virtual Console, but waiting to have enough money to buy more games. Once I got my own laptop, then, well, I couldn't help myself but dab into PC emulation, as I was already pretty savvy in using computers. It still required following countless tutorials on how to install and use such emulators. So for anyone who isn't computer savvy, which I think all my gamer homies might be surprised at how many people aren't, I would encourage to learn the fundamentals of at least Windows or any filing type computer UI. After all, most younger generations are probably more comfortable with tablet devices and encrypted Chromebooks than using Windows. Of course, there are emulator options for those devices, but I can't speak for those as I don't use them. In this video, it's only coming from my point of view of using a standard Windows desktop. I'm also coming at this from as casual a point of view as possible. In that respect, when it comes to unofficial emulation, there are a plethora of options to consider. To me, it all boils down to either using standalone emulators, their individual programs, UI, and features, or going through an emulator hub, which consolidates multiple emulators through a convenient app, primarily to give emulators more of a console-like, controller-friendly experience. There's several to consider, but the most popular of which is Retroarch. Now, I've mentioned Retroarch a number of times on this channel, and I've voiced my opinion that generally, I don't personally like to use it. Despite that though, I will admit and understand that Retroarch can be an amazing utility, and if it does make playing emulators on PC or other such emulation devices easier for new consumers, then that's great. Happy gaming. But from my experience, I don't particularly care to use Retroarch over using emulators with their original standalone software. To understand this is to understand just what Retroarch tries to achieve, and how well it does that in execution, compared to standalone emulators. See, the main reason I'm usually apprehensive to recommend PC emulators to casual gamers is simply because most of them I know aren't too comfortable using personal computers. Most would rather play whatever's published, because they don't want to have to go through all this shit. Retroarch in conception is supposed to streamline the process so that a more casual audience can engage with unofficial emulation more comfortably. And I do feel it mostly does that job well, as long as simply getting to a game is your #1 top priority. With Retroarch, the process starts with simply installing it onto your computer. This should be self-explanatory, with the only thing to consider is where on your computer do you want Retroarch and all of its contents to be. Upon starting the application, you are kind of bombarded with a bunch of options and menus to explore. While I get that Retroarch is supposed to be quite feature set, I can't help but feel the way it's presented here is a bit overwhelming and can be off-putting for first-time adopters. Like, for instance, going to change basic video settings. You go to settings, and then video, and then you still have all this stuff like scaling, synchronization, and screenshot and screensaver stuff. I don't know, even as someone who knows their way around this stuff, even I can't help but feel that there's way too many options being displayed at once. Define VSync, well, that's in synchronization, but then you have all these other parameters that, look, I get that these settings are supposed to allow Retroarch to be configured for all types of hardware situations. That's why most emulation devices you can find and play games on go through Retroarch. But as a consumer, I think I'd prefer these settings to be in some separate advanced or developer menu that can be ignored because so far it's making the menu navigation pretty cluttered and confusing to navigate. To find resolution settings, that's an output, which is where you'll also find a plethora of other settings. I feel the setting labeling here can also be a tad disorienting. Again, I get that Retroarch is supposed to function almost like an operating system for emulators, but again, the way some of them are presented here it comes off as a bit cluttered. Like having an option of what display to use if you have multiple in your setup. It's labeled as monitor index and uses numeral values instead of, telling you what display to use via its name. The need for 4 different refresh rate settings is a bit excessive. Okay, I'm getting off track here, but the point is that straight up, I'm not a fan of Retroarch's UI. There are other types of menu styles to choose from, and some of the other options may feel easier to navigate. I think if you use the UI that ripped off the cross-media bar from the PSP and PS3, you'll have a better time with it as that's a console UI many are already familiar with, and it has its own appeal. But I'm only talking about the primary Ozone UI, as that's what most are probably going to be using. Retroarch's current UI is layers and layers of settings and features, and I get that full control is the name of the game, but my days, there is so damn much. Like, if you're a hardcore tinkerer, then I'm sure this is Candyland for you, and hey, that's great, man. But I'm sorry if I don't see the application of such extensive latency settings, recording rewind settings. Why does Retroarch need to have its own volume mixer? You can say that many of these can and should be simply ignored, but my point is that real necessary settings are sandwiched in between all this other stuff, and it's a bit messy. Like, okay, let's set up a controller, assuming you have one synced up to your PC. You go to settings, then input, and then what's all this other crap? Automatic mouse grab? Polling behavior? The damn menu itself needs its own separate input controls? Okay, whatever. RetroPad binds. That's your controller input settings. Okay, port 1, I guess, since I'm player 1. Why there would be a need to manually set up your controller index is lost to me, but whatever. Okay, this right here don't do it for me, sadly. Having all the inputs arranged in a long-ass list like this makes setting up a controller's inputs feel a lot more tedious. Okay, that's enough about the menus. You have Retroarch installed. Now, how do you actually get the games? Well, you of course still need emulators to play the games. The thing with Retroarch is that it's not itself an emulator. Rather, it houses other emulators through cores, which to my understanding are an emulator's functions and features consolidated into a basic IPA that Retroarch can then use with its own interface and additional features. This is another function that helps make Retroarch so full of options and features. So from the main menu, you go to Load Core. You'll most likely not have any, so you can either install them manually or download them automatically from Retroarch's own online updater. So within Download Cores, you now have what I believe are all the possible emulators to use with Retroarch. So many options, as even one console can have multiple emulators. For the sake of simplicity and my own sanity, I'm only going to be using a couple of emulators as examples. Now, before we go any further, there is an elephant in the room, so to speak, when talking about emulators and Retroarch. Developers of emulators seem to hold some animosity towards Retroarch and its creator, libretro. Retroarch ultimately still uses the development and research done by independent emulator developers, and apparently libretro didn't have the best communication with these independent developers to get their emulators featured on Retroarch. Stories of harassment, bullying, and abuse towards emulator developers, leading to emulator progress getting shutting down, to even lives being taken. That's about all I'll say on the matter, as I'd rather it not pertain much in this video. But it should go without saying that if you truly want to support unofficial emulators and their development, then go to the developers themselves to show support. Going through Retroarch really isn't going to be doing them any favors. I'd like to keep any criticism towards Retroarch as a product itself, but if any of the outside work allegations and controversies steer you away, then I think that's perfectly understandable. That's all I'll say on those matters, as it's mostly older news, but still be mindful of it if you're getting into the emulation scene. When it comes to choosing what emulator or core to install and use, well, that might require some additional research on your part. I like to consolidate my ranking of emulators to simply which one is the most accurate and stable to play. After all, if there's one thing I feel an emulator should absolutely do when it comes to playing games, is playing them as accurately and faithfully to their original console counterparts as much as possible. Otherwise, there's no sense in these emulators acting as tasteful replacements towards original consoles, especially regarding historical value. Luckily, most of the popular emulators you'll come across are more than accurate enough in most cases, so picking will just come down to personal preference. I've been using Misc for NES, BSNES for Super Nintendo, DuckStation for PS1, and PCSX2 for PS2. After downloading the cores for the consoles you want, then all that's really left is the games. This is the part that Retroarch can't automate for you, as this is the part where you either create your own backups of games you already own, or engage with piracy!
Avast! And thy ROMs belong to me! I need those ROMs!
Only Nintendo can have these ROMs.
You're a pirate!
So are you!
He's got the ROMs!
He can't have them! They're priceless!
Exactly, they should have no price!
Oh.
So I'm not going to show or assist you in any way to acquire the games that you want, but I reckon you know how to Google, and that's all you really need. So just get out there and get some games. If you're lucky to find a full archival backup of an entire library, I'd heavily suggest getting one of those for preservation purposes and your own convenience. Should you go that route, my personal suggestion would be to have a separate folder or space for what would be your own personal collection, and only games you have or can purchase, as that's my own moral compass. But you do you. Some games can't be purchased. Either way, once you've gotten some games, ideally organized by system for convenience, then you just need to set a directory with Retroarch. This is another part that I feel Retroarch overcomplicates. You go to import content. You can either scan for an individual file or a whole directory, which also means a folder of sorts, which I feel is better. This process will seem strange for those who aren't familiar with a computer filing system, but you're just navigating through your storage devices to where your games are. Typically, I like to keep a personal game ROM library right where my emulators are, or in this case, Retroarch. So simply go to where you have Retroarch installed, then to wherever your games are. Then ideally that directory will appear on the Retroarch homepage along with a cute little icon to represent the console, which is a nice touch. Now from here, you can be considered done. Simply go to whatever console you want to play, you'll find your list of games, select a game, maybe consider renaming them since I don't think you'd want to look at USA or Revision 1 or anything like that. Even selecting the game has a bunch of additional options. One I would advise is downloading thumbnails, as it's nice to have some form of visual representation of a game outside its filing name. Having game cover art is a small touch, but goes a long way. I can't, however, say where exactly Retroarch gets these cover images. So select the game, hit run. If you have multiple cores for one console, you'll have to consider which one you want to use. And then finally, game. If you have a controller all mapped up, then you should be good to go. And that's that. From nothing to game, that's the basic process for Retroarch. While for some it may still be alienating, I feel it's mostly comprehensible to set up and easy enough to navigate if you simply ignore and opt not to mess with any foreign looking settings. Okay, so now let's do a bit of a rewind and try to follow the same overall process to get to the same spot with standalone emulators. Like before, the first step is really to consider what emulators for what consoles you plan on playing. Like before, I'd recommend emulators that are at the very least as accurate as possible. Now this process is a tad more tedious compared to Retroarch, as you're going to have to manually search up and install each individual emulator for your computer. But this ultimately just amounts to 6 minutes of Google searching until you have all the emulators you want. If you want, there are emulators that can do multiple consoles like Misc for NES and Super NES, Dolphin for GameCube and Wii. I just recently discovered Ares, which supports a shit ton of different consoles and focuses on accuracy. You may miss out on specific emulator features, but if you're looking for the easy way, this is it. I'll still be approaching this in a one console per emulator mindset. Installing emulators usually involves simply unzipping a folder to your desired destination, are using an installer which more or less does the same thing. My advice would be having all your emulators in one spot for easier navigating. The simple act of renaming a folder will make for cleaner, easier navigation, so I'd encourage it, but it's not necessary. This is also the part where you need to acquire your games. If you do know how to make your own backups from either using cartridge dumpers or homebrew software, then that's absolutely the most legal way to play on unofficial emulators. But of course, if that sounds like something you don't want to do, as it also could be impossible for you in normal circumstances, so the only choice you may have is to humbly and earnestly engage in the morally gray, but so many people do it anyway, area of taking part in the necessary evil that's commonly known in this community as piracy! So once you have your games, then a few steps of creating separate folders labeled as either games or ROMs within each directory of your respective emulators will save you many a future hassle. From here, loading up an emulator should be as easy as clicking its primary .exe or executable. To make this process even more seamless is as simple as creating shortcuts that you can keep on your desktop, or pinning the .exe somewhere on your computer for easy access like the taskbar. Then comes the matter of the emulators themselves. I feel this is where one of my draws with Retroarch stems: controller support. Windows and emulators really ain't controller friendly outside the game, so any settings tweaks must be done with keyboard and mouse. It's mostly a nothing issue, but since emulators don't have their own integrated home menu, then it can be a tad tedious to have to switch to keyboard and mouse to make adjustments. This is only a nitpick, but as someone who PC games on couch and on a big screen, then having to get up to change things adds up after a while. But at least navigating these emulators with keyboard and mouse is very straightforward. The problem is that Retroarch's UI just isn't that good. Even with controller navigation, this UI really isn't much better compared to keyboard and mouse. It can get even more confusing in-game. So another appeal with Retroarch is having its own home menu feature, pausing the game and providing emulator-specific options. From here, you can make and load save states and change the controls, along with even more crap. Again, I can't stress enough how much it sucks to navigate these freaking menus. If you're not paying attention, you might back out enough to end up back at the Retroarch home menu. There is a shortcut back to the emulator settings, but since this page of settings looks no different from the rest, continues to make navigation needlessly challenging. I know it seems self-explanatory, but I'll be honest and admit when I first used Retroarch, I straight up got lost in these settings trying to find the setting I'm looking for. It doesn't help that the emulator settings have options and toggles very similar to the ones in the main Retroarch menu. It took a while for me to get that, okay, everything in the quick menu pertains to only the emulator core and nothing else. I know it sounds like nitpicking, but come on, many aspects about this UI are so extra. Like, okay, I wanted to change the opacity settings because I felt the menu was too transparent. So you go to User Interface, Appearance, Opacity, and good grief. Why the hell does there need to be this many variable amounts for a setting like this? Sure, it's very precise and customizable, but having only 3 or 5 options, or a slider, would have been far more intuitive in my opinion. You don't need this much control. I found that in menu item visibility, you can actually toggle what menu options are visible, and this applies to every option. You can totally fuck up Retroarch by literally disabling every menu option there is. Like literally, you can straight up get rid of the option to quit, restart, or even load a game, completely destroying this program's functionality. I had to delete the config file to restore everything. I don't know if it goes without saying, but why is this an option? I get that Retroarch is fully customizable, but really, why is this even possible? So I guess if a simple menu is all you want, then you can adjust it accordingly, but this still seems like a needless task to put on a user. Standalone emulators, while favoring keyboard and mouse navigation, are designed a lot more intuitively, appropriately labeled and organized to make any function easy to find. The windowed nature of using emulators like this complements a list view more, as everything can usually be displayed at once. Where in Retroarch you're scrolling and shifting through many pages of different menu options. These standalone emulators also follow a basic design template that makes using them feel consistent enough. Once you've navigated your necessary settings like graphics and controller mapping in one emulator, you can do it in another. Special mention to Dolphin, DuckStation, and PCSX2 for having the best overall UI with a game list view, and this alone makes a click and boot experience as quick as it can be. I'm sorry, but I don't like having to go to System, load game or ROM, and then pick from a separate window every time I want to boot a game. Finding necessary video and controller settings also just feels better here. Controller especially, because having an on-screen controller icon display makes mapping buttons way more comfortable than doing it off a list. This is emulator specific, but even using a list in these emulators feels better than Retroarch. Mapping N64 inputs, big pain in the ass with Retroarch. Because of the tedious list view, and Retroarch labeling the N64C buttons as plus and minus values. I mean, come on, man. Is using arrows or up, down, left, right too informal for emulator master gamers? I suppose this is where the general comfort with keyboard and mouse does have practical function. To fully customize all your settings, assuming you already know what you're going for, feels far quicker and snappy on a standalone emulator compared to Retroarch. Then, once it's all done, using a standalone emulator is just as quick as Retroarch. Start the emulator, make sure your controller is connected, click the game, and go. In that regard, I don't really see much appeal anymore to using Retroarch opposed to standalone emulators if convenience is the name of the game. Sure, the setup of standalone emulators may be a bit more tedious, but it's a process that realistically you only have to do once. And once it's all done, using emulators couldn't be snappier. After that, I don't really see too much incentive to use Retroarch anymore, from a casual experience. There are exclusive features in Retroarch you won't find on standalone emulators, like HDR injection, black frame insertion, and robust video shaders. While features like HDR and BFI are certainly nice, I still had issues with them. Like recently I've run into a basic issue where simply toggling the HDR setting causes the program to crash or at least only show a black screen, which requires closing out and restarting Retroarch to find the setting has been properly toggled. One time I noticed that my refresh rate chugged horribly. I confirmed this when checking the estimated screen refresh rate. I could not figure out what the problem was. So, what I discovered is that if HDR is enabled in Retroarch and disabled on my display, it causes this horrendous refresh rate. I had HDR disabled on my PC monitor as its HDR is horrible and better to have off. However, having HDR on your display disabled removes the HDR toggle in Retroarch. So then I had to re-enable the shitty HDR on my monitor, go back to Retroarch where the HDR setting would finally appear, disable it, and then the refresh rate became normal again. All because I had HDR on my OLED TV enabled, and I do swap between my displays occasionally. I'm pretty sure this issue was a result of me using the Vulkan video driver, but it goes to show the kind of problems you can run into when using Retroarch, many of which won't be easy to diagnose. I tried using other video drivers, but I ran into other unique issues with them too, like the estimated screen refresh rate getting overshot and needlessly overclocking my GPU, or completely breaking the BFI setting, making it unusable. I'm not trying to find problems here. These are realistic scenarios I ran into just from trying to use Retroarch and its special features. Needless to say, it's a pain in the ass, and I can't imagine any casual gamer having the patience to deal with this crap. My one personal incentive for using Retroarch was using the CyberLab's Death to Pixels CRT shaders. They are some of the best CRT filters I've seen, and using HDR and BFI can make for a really convincing CRT-like experience. And you want to use them because the shaders themselves make the picture really dark. But I don't even want to use these shaders anymore if going through these additional settings are going to completely break Retroarch the way they have. Fuck that, man. I hear you can just use these shaders through reshade, but honestly, I'm done with reshade. I don't even like using that anymore. Oh, look, say what you will about how expensive the Tink 4K is to use its CRT filters. At least it works. So I can't even recommend Retroarch for using complex CRT shaders, because I can't guarantee you won't run into major issues that won't have clear solutions. Standalone emulators may also have their own issues, but nothing to the extent of Retroarch. Issues with standalone emulators are usually easier to pinpoint because an emulator's features will usually directly tell you how a setting will affect the emulator and game performance, with recommended values in case you're unsure about using them. Worst case scenario, the game won't run optimally, not the entire emulator having a seizure. I hate to sound frustrated, but that's what the Retroarch experience has been for me. Frustrating. At points, it feels like it doesn't stop. Had an issue with the resolution not displaying correctly at first. Was set to 4K, but it was clear that the resolution was far lower. Tried to reset it with Retroarch, then became way too zoomed in at 4K. Play around with a few settings if you can actually navigate it. Try toggling shit, sometimes crashing Retroarch, forcing a reset. Try going into the config file itself to manually set the full screen display resolution. Still borked. Well, what the fuck, man? What's the deal? Oh, of course. I have to set my display application size to 100 or Retroarch strokes. Fuck's sake. Now, fucking what now? Why is the frame rate tanking? Try messing with every setting, but none of them do jack shit, except maybe crash Retroarch. Oh, of course, just gotta delete the Mupin64 Plus folder in the config folder in the Retroarch directory. Now N64 games run at full speed again. Fuck. Even when ignoring everything that's caused these frustrations, I don't find any tangible benefit from using Retroarch opposed to standalone emulators. Especially when I'm certainly not going to be using all my emulators through Retroarch. Dolphin, DuckStation, PCSX2, and more aren't getting updated and support on Retroarch anymore, so there's no point. At best, Retroarch can act as a hub for a select couple of emulators, and that works fine. There are other programs that can act as a standardized emulator hub. I tried Emulation Station, keyword being tried, then moved on to Launchbox, which I do like in theory. So basically, it's a software launcher. You can import, organize, and consolidate all sorts of programs to have them accessible with this launcher, and that includes emulators. The appealing thing about this is that all game functions solely rely on the standalone emulator. Any settings you'd want to change or alter will have to go through the standalone emulator. It is a further tedious process of importing all your emulators and games into Launchbox. The idea is that through here, you can simply click on a game and it will automatically launch the emulator and start the game. Very appealing, honestly. It's a lot of work, but it provides a very convenient, visually pleasing, and quick way to access your emulated games. You'd still want to go into your individual emulator settings and do things like tweak your preferred graphics settings and enable features like full screen so you're not looking at the emulator window when the game starts. The presentation is nice. I like the console icons and the game cover arts. If you're after a console-like click-and-play experience, then this could be the program for you. I guess there's more features you can use, but that requires paying for it, which, no thanks. I still think, ultimately, I'd recommend going through individual standalone emulators, as once the process is done, it's accessible as it needs to be. That's not to say there won't still be issues. I still have problems with controllers and emulators, either from my mapped button inputs getting randomly deleted, or issues with Steam completely taking over my controller inputs. One solution I had was simply launching the emulator through Steam, but I'd like to keep these emulators as independent as possible. And before you ask, yes, I've tried disabling Steam input for desktop. The only way I found to fix this was completely shutting down Steam and Task Manager and fully restarting the controller, which really sucks to do. Dolphin will remain for me the best emulator simply because official controller support is so seamless. Plug in the GameCube controller adapter, plug in controller, set it in Dolphin, and never worry about mapping controllers ever again. Or with the Wiimote, simply pressing the sync button with Dolphin running and it'll effortlessly sync. No issues with Steam, no having to map buttons, seamless. I think that just about covers everything I wanted to talk about with this subject. With playing emulators on PC, the sky is the fucking limit. You have so many options that I legit don't think I can cover them all. So many variables and quirks to consider. It can be extremely overwhelming to a newcomer, which is where I still see the need for standard retro re-releases. They're always going to be behind what fans are accomplishing on PC emulators. Even as someone who generally keeps things old school, I'd still love to see the smallest of touch-ups brought to older titles. You really don't know how transformative simple things like gyro, full camera control, and higher frame rates can make an already great game even better. But such enhancements absolutely cannot have any lasting blemishes because it then makes the game come off as an unfinished product, which is why I opt from using them, as most exhibit some caveat. The most I like to do is use CRT filters. If you feel the same way, then Retroarch will probably be the best route for you if you're willing to be patient with it. But considering the hassle, I think you're better off booting up Ares, selecting CRT Royale, I like the composite version, and that looks damn fine to me. I would like to take a quick moment and thank those who've watched the video this far. I was going to mention recomps again, as I see those as the next evolution for retro games beyond emulation, but I figure that's a topic for another video. This video already got longer than it needed to be. For anyone who wants to try PC emulation, do it. Absolutely do it. It'll be a very educational and rewarding trip down countless memory lanes. But remember, the more power you have at your disposal, the less it'll be about the game. That concludes it for me today, so all I have left to say is thank you for watching.